To understand how we got here, you need to look at the exact numbers right now. According to the federal government's own data from January 2026, exactly 650,000 people are currently unhoused nationwide. At the exact same time, major municipalities are spending hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars annually to combat it. Yet the number of men sleeping on the concrete continues to rapidly climb. Hundreds of thousands of these individuals are adult men sleeping in vehicles, under highway overpasses, or directly exposed to the freezing elements. You probably see these men every single day on your morning commute. You drive past the tents patched together with torn blue tarps and the rusted vans parked on industrial side streets. The traditional answer to this problem has always been the massive city shelter system, but that system is fracturing under its own weight. Men on the streets will tell you that congregate shelters are often overcrowded, structurally unsafe, and heavily policed. They operate with rigid curfews that make holding down a night shift or keeping personal belongings secure practically impossible. For a man who has lost everything, surrendering his last bit of autonomy to sleep on a plastic cot in a room with 100 strangers is often a line he refuses to cross. So they stay outside. And while these men brace against the winter wind, city halls across the country remain paralyzed in endless political debates. Elected officials hold press conferences to announce sweeping billion-dollar housing programs that look incredible on a presentation board. But those same programs come chained to decade-long timelines, endless zoning committees, and layers of crushing bureaucratic red tape. The massive government machinery is simply too slow, too expensive, and utterly disconnected from the brutal reality of surviving tonight. The gap between a $2 billion promise and a freezing man on a sidewalk is just too wide. That contrast tells you everything you need to know. We will look at exactly how badly those billion-dollar budgets fail in just a minute. But that massive systemic failure is exactly why ordinary people decided to stop waiting for a 10-year plan to reach year 3. Instead, they grabbed their wallets, drove down to the local hardware store, and started building a way out. The man who built that first shelter was not a city planner. He did not hold a fancy government title or sit on a zoning committee. He was just an ordinary mechanic named Michael, simply tired of watching his neighbors freeze. Michael drove the same route every day. He saw the same men huddled under wet tarps, shivering against the concrete as temperatures dropped below freezing. For months, he assumed someone in charge would eventually do something about it. But nobody did. One afternoon, Michael looked at a man sleeping in the freezing rain, and something in him snapped. Not in a sad way, in an angry way. He realized that if he waited for the city to approve a blueprint, that man would die on the pavement. So Michael drove his truck to a local hardware store and started pulling materials off the shelves. He didn't need a government grant. He spent exactly $300 of his own money. His blueprint was entirely in his head, focused purely on basic survival, insulation, and speed. He bought lengths of flexible PVC pipe, corrugated plastic, heavy-duty screws, and rolls of silver, reflective mylar insulation. He took the materials back to his driveway and immediately got to work. The design he settled on was a mini Quonset hut, measuring roughly 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. By bending the PVC pipes into steep arches and securing them to a solid wooden base, he created a rigid, wind-resistant frame in under an hour. He wrapped the skeleton in reflective mylar, designed to bounce a person's body heat back down onto them instead of letting it escape. Then he covered the exterior in thick, waterproof corrugated plastic, sealing every single seam against the weather. He attached a solid wooden door to the front, and most importantly, he installed a deadbolt to keep the person inside completely secure. The entire build took just 3 hours. There was no red tape, no permits, no environmental studies, and no endless committee meetings to stall progress. It was just one man with a saw, a drill, and a few $100s, building a weatherproof survival pod on his driveway. But looking at the finished structure from the outside is only half the story. To truly understand why this $300 shelter works, you have to know what it feels like to step inside one on a freezing night. It was a Tuesday night when a freezing, torrential rain began to hammer the concrete. Inside one of Michael's newly built mini Quonsets, a man named Thomas lay perfectly dry. He listened to the heavy drops drumming against a thick, corrugated plastic roof. It was a sound that used to mean soaked clothes, ruined belongings, and the immediate threat of hypothermia. But tonight, Thomas reached up and pressed his bare hand against the silver mylar walls. They were warm. Because the shelter was so compact and heavily insulated, his own body heat had raised the interior temperature a full 20 degrees higher than the freezing air outside. He did not have to sleep with one eye open to protect his shoes or his backpack. He had a solid latch secured from the inside. For a man who had survived outside for 3 years, that simple barrier provided something a wet tarp never could, a profound sense of dignity, an actual night of uninterrupted sleep. But the city did not celebrate this $300 miracle. Instead, less than 2 weeks later, the flashing yellow lights of a heavy municipal sanitation truck pulled up to the curb. City officials stepped out onto the wet pavement, holding clipboards and citing municipal codes written over 50 years ago. They did not ask Thomas if he was warm. They did not care that his clothes were finally dry. They simply slapped a bright orange confiscation notice right over his front door. A spokesperson for the city later told reporters that the structures were an unpermitted safety hazard placed illegally on public property. Records show the officials told Michael that the men living inside these weatherproof pods would be much better off transitioning into official city shelters. Keep in mind, this was the exact same shelter system that these men had actively fled because of rampant theft, violence, and overcrowding. The city's official response to a citizen spending his own $300 to keep a vulnerable man from freezing to death was to send a massive garbage truck to haul it all away to the dump. They gave the residents exactly 72 hours to vacate before the demolition crews arrived. The public outrage that followed was absolute and immediate, but instead of quietly packing up his tools and surrendering to the bureaucracy, Michael looked at those orange stickers and dug his heels in. If the city was going to confiscate one survival pod, he was going to build 10 more. Local news stations picked up the story of the orange confiscation sticker. Within hours, footage of the $300 shelter went completely viral across social media. People were furious that a city failing to house its own citizens was actively destroying a working, citizen-funded solution. Michael's inbox flooded overnight. Carpenters, retirees, and local business owners reached out asking how they could help. Instead of quietly backing down and packing up his tools, Michael launched a crowdfunding campaign online. The initial goal was just enough to buy materials for 2 or 3 more pods. Records show he raised over $25,000 in a single weekend. With those funds in hand, Michael drove straight back to the hardware store. He didn't just replace the single shelter the city threatened to crush. He bought enough PVC pipe, corrugated plastic, and heavy-duty screws to build 10 more. And this time, he wasn't building them alone in his driveway. The unhoused men from the neighborhood physically showed up to help. Men who had spent years sleeping on wet pavement were suddenly measuring wood, cutting plastic, and driving screws alongside local volunteers. They became the architects of their own survival. As the operation scaled, the initial blueprint rapidly evolved. They mounted the solid wooden bases on heavy-duty caster wheels. This meant the mini Quonsets were now legally classified as mobile personal property rather than permanent structures, making them significantly harder for sanitation crews to legally confiscate. They added small, solar-powered LED lights to the curved ceilings. They installed smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, and adjustable ventilation flaps to prevent condensation. Despite these life-saving upgrades, the total cost per unit hovered right around $350. Within a month, a makeshift assembly line of neighbors was producing 2 fully insulated shelters every single day. For the cost of one night in a standard hotel, they were pulling a man off the freezing concrete and handing him a key to his own secure door. The local government had tried to kill a single $300 experiment. Instead, they accidentally ignited a defiant, unstoppable grassroots movement. But this profound frustration with broken bureaucracy was not just happening in one place. We are about to see exactly what happens when combat veterans apply the same logic. Because over 1,000 miles away, a completely different group was quietly taking matters into their own hands. The instinct to grab a hammer instead of waiting for a politician is contagious. Over 2,000 miles away in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a local coalition of combat veterans reached the exact same breaking point. They had watched their own brothers in arms return from deployments, only to end up shivering under highway overpasses. The existing transitional housing systems in the city were utterly failing these specific men. Many veterans struggling with severe PTSD found massive, noisy, and heavily populated shelter environments completely triggering. The rigid rules and lack of personal space felt less like a sanctuary and more like a deployment cell. So they simply walked out and chose the freezing concrete instead. The local veterans decided they were done watching their friends freeze while politicians argued over budgets. They did not wait for a federal grant or a 10-year zoning plan. They secured a vacant patch of private land, picked up their own tools, and started building a micro-village of insulated survival pods. Their blueprint was just as pragmatic, tailored specifically for the brutal, sub-zero Midwestern winters. They constructed 8 by 10-foot wooden micro-shelters. Each unit was heavily insulated with rigid foam board and featured a sloped corrugated metal roof, a secure entryway, and a small, safe electric heater. Records show the total cost per unit ran exactly $2,500 in raw materials. Local church groups and off-duty carpenters showed up to help them raise the walls. Within a single month, a barren dirt lot was transformed into a highly structured, fiercely protected community of tiny homes. For $2,500, a man who had fought for his country was finally given a dry bed, physical security, and a quiet space with a deadbolt where he could actually decompress. They did not just build wooden boxes. They built a physical foundation for recovery. The veterans living in these micro-shelters were not constantly looking over their shoulders to protect their boots from being stolen. They were sleeping through the night. They were finally able to think about tomorrow morning instead of just surviving tonight. The success of these cheap, citizen-built shelters proves a highly replicable model of human pragmatism. And when you compare the undeniable success of these micro-villages against massive government housing programs, the financial math becomes absolutely devastating. And the numbers tell the real story. Take a look at the official budgets from some of the largest municipalities on the West Coast over the last 4 years. In one major city alone, the local government authorized a massive emergency housing initiative that cost taxpayers over $350 million. They promised sweeping results. They promised a permanent end to street encampments. But according to their own data, roughly 45% of the individuals placed into those expensive, slow-moving government housing programs ended up right back on the streets within a year. $350 million. And nearly half of the people they tried to help wound up sleeping on the freezing concrete again. Now, compare that massive bureaucratic failure directly to the grassroots micro-shelters. When you look at the retention rates for the $2,500 veteran pods in Milwaukee or the $300 mini Quonsets built by ordinary mechanics, the contrast is absolutely devastating. Records show that over 92% of the men who move into a community-supported micro-shelter are still safely housed 12 months later. That is not a rounding error. That is a fundamental difference in how human beings actually operate. For a fraction of the cost of a single government environmental impact study, ordinary citizens are producing long-term survival outcomes that city planners can only dream of. A volunteer with a truck full of PVC pipe and corrugated plastic is yielding better results than a committee armed with a 9-figure budget. Why? Because the men sleeping outside tonight do not need a committee. They do not need a 3-year transitional plan locked behind miles of administrative red tape. They need a roof right now. They need a latch that closes from the inside and a door that stays shut. The math is completely unarguable. The grassroots solution is faster. It is infinitely cheaper, and the official records prove that it actually keeps vulnerable men off the pavement. You would assume that city halls across the country would look at this hard data, celebrate the volunteers, and immediately adopt the micro-shelter model. You would think they would be handing out medals to the people doing their jobs for them. But that is not what is happening. Despite the undeniable proof that the citizen-led model works, the men building these pods are still fighting a grueling, daily war against local laws. But for every success story, there is a fight with local government. The primary weapon used against these grassroots builders is not malice. It is outdated municipal zoning laws. City codes written in the 1970s and 1980s simply never imagined a 32-square-foot, heavily insulated mini Quonset on caster wheels as a legitimate human residence. Because the code does not specifically allow for it, the default bureaucratic answer is to ban it entirely. If Michael wants to build a $300 shelter in his driveway to save a man from freezing to death tonight, it takes him roughly 3 hours of labor. But if he wants to place that exact same structure legally on an empty, city-owned dirt lot, the paperwork alone takes over 18 months. Records show that volunteers must navigate environmental impact reviews, utility connection mandates, and multiple rounds of public zoning hearings just to secure a temporary permit. The tension sits squarely at the heart of this entire movement. On one side, you have ordinary men prioritizing fast, cheap survival on the pavement. On the other side, you have a slow, expensive bureaucracy that insists on perfection before it allows any progress. Officials argue that these shelters lack indoor plumbing and formal heating systems, making them substandard housing. But the unhoused men living in them counter with a brutal, undeniable logic. A private space and a dry roof, even without a flush toilet, beat a wet sleeping bag on a freezing sidewalk every single time. Slowly, however, that logic is beginning to crack the institutional resistance. Faced with overwhelming public pressure and undeniable success rates, a handful of local governments are finally conceding. In certain progressive districts, zoning boards are actively debating new, specific ordinances designed to legally categorize and protect these micro-villages. Instead of sending sanitation crews to haul the structures to the dump, a few forward-thinking cities are now leasing vacant municipal lots directly to the volunteers for $1 a year. It is a massive victory, but it is a victory 1 inch by grueling inch. And it forces us to step back and look at what this entire struggle actually means to the future of how we handle this crisis. So, how exactly are ordinary Americans building $300 survival shelters for men they have never met, one sheet of corrugated plastic at a time, with their own hands and using their own money? They are simply refusing to wait for a 10-year political plan to finally reach year 3. When Michael drove to that hardware store and bought his first roll of reflective Mylar, he didn't have a grand institutional strategy. He wasn't running a certified nonprofit. He just saw an older man shivering on the wet pavement and decided he was entirely done walking past him. That raw, pragmatic impulse is what drives this entire movement. It is why local carpenters are mounting heavy caster wheels onto wooden bases. It is why off-duty combat veterans in Milwaukee are sawing rigid foam board in sub-zero temperatures. They all understand the exact same truth. A billion-dollar housing initiative might look fantastic on a polished presentation board, but a $300 mini Quonset actually keeps a man from freezing to death tonight. There's still over 650,000 people out there on the streets right now. Many of them are adult men bracing against the cold, praying they survive until sunrise. But out there in the dark, an ordinary mechanic installed a secure barrier on a solid wooden door for a man he barely knew. He gave that man a warm, dry space that actually belonged to him. And maybe that hyper-local, deeply practical empathy has always been the only real answer. Neighbors building physical foundations for their neighbors, one cheap, weatherproof shelter at a time. If this story opened your eyes to what is really happening on the ground, hit subscribe. I cover grassroots stories exactly like this every single week. The kind that show you the incredible things ordinary citizens are building when the bureaucratic cameras are not rolling. And if you care about this issue and want to see how you can actually help, I put together a free blueprint detailing the most effective micro-shelter organizations in the country. The link to download it is right down in the description below. Finally, click the video on your screen right now. The story I cover there connects directly to the exact kind of citizen-led defiance you just watched. I will see you in that one.